Well, welcome everyone to the December meeting of the Ohio State Emeritus Academy. We have a few items of business to conduct prior to our talk. First, I want to mention that it's come to our attention that some of our Emeritus Academy members are not included on the Emeritus Academy website. So I would ask you to go to the opening page of the Emeritus Academy website, click on the members link, and make sure that you are included. And if you are not, please let me know. Also, I encourage you to submit a contribution to the Emeritus Academy newsletter. The deadline for the next newsletter is in 2 days, Friday, December 3rd. So please submit your contribution directly to our Dean Nelson at nelson.13@osu.edu. That's nelson.13. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, February 2nd, and our speaker will be Michael Griever, who is the Academy Professor from the Division of Hematology in Ohio State School of Medicine. And his talk will be The Ohio State Legacy of Hairy Cell Leukemia, a rare form of adult chronic leukemia. Also, before I talk today, it's my pleasure to introduce 5 new members to the Emeritus Academy. In alphabetical order, these are Michael Cadwell. Michael has been at Ohio State since 1989. He is from the School of Architecture, where he was the director of the School of Architecture. His research and service is centered on modern architecture and the role of construction as a transformative cultural act. In addition to his research, he will continue to serve on the University Design Review Board and the board of the Columbus Neighborhood Design Center. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And next is Hans Klompen. Hans has been at Ohio State since 1996 and was a professor of the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology. His research specialty is the systematics and evolutionary ecology of mice. And his research has taken him quite literally all over the globe, including Panama, Republic of Georgia, French Guiana, the Netherlands, Philippines, and Brazil, just to mention a few. He is also a member of several editorial boards in journals that are in his research field. Well, Hans.
Welcome. Thank you.
Next is Mo Tamimi. Mo is from mechanical aerospace engineering and has been at Ohio State since 1985. His research centers on the physical understanding and numerical simulation of fluid flow in various engineering applications. His work is applicable to many things, including NASA's research, the Air Force Office of Research, the Naval Office of Research, and the U.S. Department of Energy, plus others. Mo, welcome to the Emeritus Academy.
Thank you very much.
Philip Samuels is from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in the School of Medicine, where he has been very active in practice, student recruiting, and student mentoring. He's given lectures on the medical applications of pregnancy throughout the United States and in China, Israel, and Australia. Welcome, Philip, although I'm not sure you're here. And last is Peter Shane. Peter's in the College of Law, where he has been since at least 2003. And since 2016, he has published 2 books and a 3rd book entitled Democracy's Chief Executive, What Was the Constitutional Presidency? What the Constitutional Presidency Means Today, is expected to be published in 2022. And if I can editorialize, I can't imagine a more welcome current political topic in our current political situation in which we live here. So welcome, Peter. And welcome all you new members. We're very happy that you have joined us. Despite the challenges of living during crazy COVID days and perhaps many emeriti not coming to campus as regularly as possible, we want to continue to expand the Emeritus Academy membership. I ask you to talk to your Emeritus friends and colleagues and encourage them to apply for membership to the Emeritus Academy. The next call for new member applications will be circulated during the middle of February with a due date on March 4th. And I'll send out notices of that when the time is closer. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Helen Malone from the Office of Academic Affairs, who, along with Giovanna Zanders, Jody Poth, and Jason Hammond, work behind the scene to make the Emeritus Academy a reality. Helen?
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the welcome. On behalf of the Office of Academic Affairs, to the new members of the Emeritus Academy, welcome. One of the things that I so enjoy about engaging with the Emeritus Academy is to observe and see all of the great work that our members are continuing to do in Ohio, in the country, around the world. One of the things that I think is so amazing about this group is the continued engagement with one another across units, across colleges, and really learning about what each of you is doing is really quite impressive. This group is one that actually we don't emulate as much with our faculty who are current faculty. And so you have the somewhat unique experience of having the opportunity on a regular basis to engage with one another, to hear from one another about the work that you're doing. Hopefully in the not too distant future, you'll be able to come back together in person, get back to your Buckeyes. I will say that I just want to echo Bill's acknowledgement of Giovanna, Jody, and Jason, who really are instrumental in making these events come together so smoothly. So we rely really heavily at the university on our staff, and the Emeritus Academy has a really superior staff supporting it, and I am always grateful for their work. So I do hope that you enjoy today's lecture. Again, welcome to the Emeritus Academy, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Helen. I unfortunately need to say that the steering committee has chosen to continue having virtual talks for the spring quarter until the university eases some of the restrictions. We feel like we shouldn't change our current format for lectures. Hopefully, as Helen said, we can return to in-person lectures sooner than later. Okay, when our talk begins today, we ask you to turn off your video and mute your microphone until the talk is finished. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, James Marshall Unger. Jim is from the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature, where he was chair from 1988 to 2004. Dr. Unger has been very active in various research service activities, including the author of several books and working with the National Foreign Language Center that has developed curricula for American high schools and colleges. He's given talks on his work around the world, including many venues in North America, Western Europe, and Asia. The most recent books are Sangaku Proofs, a Japanese mathematician at work, published in 2015, and Sangaku Reflections, a Japanese mathematician teaches, in 2018. Our talk today is titled Misunderstanding Chinese Characters, What's Been Learned Since 1998. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On the evening of 12 May 1998, at the behest of Dean Kermit Hall, I delivered my inaugural lecture as a new full professor in the College of Humanities. In that lecture, I focused on pseudoscientific claims about Chinese characters and misunderstandings about how they are used in the writing systems of East Asia. I reviewed historical and linguistic research that disproved descriptions of entire writing systems as ideographic. I explained how psycholinguistic research on the reading of Japanese showed that phonological recoding of visual data precedes semantic interpretation, I pointed out that learning written Chinese was very similar to learning Gregg shorthand at a professional level. And I poked fun at various postmodernist pronouncements about the otherness of Chinese characters. I thought a little humor would be all right because 2 years earlier, in the journal Lingua Franca, the mathematician Alan Socalleds had revealed that he was the author of an article entitled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. The postmodernist journal Social Text published Socalleds' article in May 1996 without getting a physicist to vet it. Socalleds' hoax showed that doctrinaire postmodernism was an emperor with no clothes. By comparison, my little jokes were no big deal, and I thought they'd go down well, but I was wrong. When the time for questions came, some colleagues, such as Tom Kasoulis of Comparative Studies, took offense. I had committed academic lèse-majesté by speaking ill of Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and Julia Kristeva. Jeffrey Parker, a distinguished historian of the Spanish Empire, was apparently upset by my claim that Catholic missionaries had originated the notion that Chinese characters were ideograms, much like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which Europeans had thought were ideograms since roughly the 4th century. Things got more heated when Mary Beckman of the linguistics department spoke up forcefully in my defense. It became clear that going after old sacred cows might be all right, but going after young sacred calves was not. For instance, no one in the English department objected to my criticisms of Ezra Pound's ideas about Chinese characters. Similar criticisms had been made back in the 1940s by the Yale sinologist George A. Kennedy. Pound purported to be able to translate a Chinese poem by divining the meaning of each character from its shape. His sample text, a quatrain of pentasyllabic lines, is shown here in left to right format with Pound's translation underneath. Kennedy explained why Pound's procedure was invalid and highlighted inaccuracies in his translation. Were my colleagues in English mindful of Socalleds' article in Lingua Franca? Or was Pound's imagism out of vogue? I still don't know. At any rate, having sparked a more than lively discussion, I got to work expanding my talk into a book the next day. It came out in 2004 under the title Ideogram, Chinese Characters and the Myth of Disembodied Meaning. Since then, much new research has been done that supports its central thesis, and it is that new research I want to discuss today. But first, some news about the sadly abused Chinese poem you're looking at. Pound copied it from the famous art collector and Orientalist Ernest Fenollosa, for whom Pound served as literary executor. In my lecture and book, I noted that Kennedy could not identify its author and speculated that it was probably written in Japan. I can now confirm this. The poet is alleged to have been the famously precocious 9th century Japanese scholar Sugawara no Michizane. It is said to have been composed in 855 CE, when Sugawara was just 11 years old. If this sounds like a tall tale, remember that Pascal at age 12, and with no formal training in geometry, allegedly proved that the sum of the angles in a triangle is 180 degrees. But I digress. Fenollosa's version of the poem contained mistakes. He omitted the title, Gazing at Plum Blossoms on a Moonlit Night, and he or someone else had miscopied 2 characters. The one shown here in red occurs at the end of the second line and destroys the mandatory Middle Chinese rhyme in even numbered lines. Also, when the character shown here in green is corrected, it forms a compound noun with the preceding character. The compound means either calyx or, as here, bunch of flowers. Unaware of Chinese word morphology and Fenollosa's errors, Pound was just groping in the dark. An accurate translation of the whole poem is shown here on the right. Incidentally, Emperor Uda wanted to appoint Sugawara as ambassador to Tang China. Although renowned for his poetry and literary Chinese, Sugawara not only declined the honor, but also encouraged the emperor to discontinue embassies to China altogether. Most likely, he feared that he would be humiliated when it was discovered he could not actually speak Chinese. If called upon to recite this poem, Sugawara would have glossed each character in Japanese, rearranged the glosses in Japanese syntactic order, and thrown in particles and endings as necessary. One cannot help thinking of the way European monks, at almost the same time, were busily writing interlinear Old English and Old Irish glosses in their Latin texts. All this, however, is relatively minor stuff compared with the new research I shall now introduce. Let's begin with the work of Stanislas Dehaene, first made widely accessible in his 2009 book, Reading in the Brain, The New Science of How We Read. Dehaene's discoveries about the process of reading, based largely on fMRI measurements and other new experimental techniques, show that writing of all kinds is processed in the brain in more or less the same way, and that phonological recoding of the graphic signal plays an important role regardless of the writing system. Before Dehaene, this was the way it was believed that the brain processed orthographic words during reading. Raw visual data travel on a linear pathway from the visual cortex to an area where they are analyzed, enabling the recovery of auditory forms in the part of the brain called Wernicke's area. These forms go on to trigger images of words in Broca's area, which are then transmitted to yet other locations where what we loosely call comprehension occurs. Dehaene showed that the red area, which he calls the brain's letterbox, in fact occupies a different place in the brain. Note also the previously unidentified region marked in yellow, which plays a crucial role in controlling the connection between the visual cortex and the letterbox. Instead of the simple linear black pathway, the brain utilizes two parallel networks marked in green and orange, which are linked together by several interactive connections. Here is Dehaene's sketch illustrating how all this works. From salient visual data, the brain determines the orthographic units present in a word and initiates two parallel processes. One, called lexical access, determines the identity of the graphic word. The other, called spelling to sound conversion, recovers the units linguists call phonemes. Spelling to sound conversion enables recovery of the syllabic framework of the spoken word. Meanwhile, lexical access initiates two further parallel processes, lexical conversion and semantic interpretation. During normal reading, everything transpires in a matter of milliseconds. What is crucial is the sequence of the processes and their race-like competition. These are the same whether one is reading out loud or silently. The reason that fluent reading is so rapid and seemingly effortless is that the phonological identity of a word typically occurs before its semantic interpretation in context is complete. This is why people laugh when they realize a polysemous word is being used in a sense they hadn't expected, or fail to catch a misspelled homonym. Notice that in Dehaene's example, there's a potential three-way homonym confusion. Besides the vegetable carrot, there's the proofreader's carrot and the jeweler's carrot. Equally important, De'Anne showed that the same processes are engaged in the same way for all languages and writing systems. This confirms earlier experimental results in Japanese reading. De'Anne was unaware of these, but I described them in my book. Very briefly, experimenters focused on 2 of the 6 theoretically possible ways that one Chinese character, or as the Japanese say, kanji, might be confused with a different kanji. There are 3 dimensions in which 2 kanji can differ: sound, form, or so-called meaning, S, F, M for short. In confusions of both types 3 and 4, shown here, one kanji is incorrect, and we have a real word and a non-word. The so-called meanings of the correct and false kanji are unrelated. In both the non-word and the real word, one kanji is the same, and the false kanji partially resembles the correct one. The difference between types 3 and 4 is that in a type 3 error, the false kanji can take the same reading as the correct one in another context. In a type 4 error, it cannot. Therefore, if the difference in a so-called meanings were decisive, test subjects should catch, or fail to catch, errors of both types 3 and 4 about equally often. But if phonological recoding precedes semantic recognition most of the time, which is precisely what De'Anne's fMRI studies showed, then subjects should catch type 4 errors far more often than type 3 errors. And that is exactly what the experimenters found. More generally, De'Anne's fMRI results confirm that Chinese characters, even in Japanese writing, provide useful information about speech sounds. This is mostly because, as can be seen in the experimental stimuli just summarized, partial resemblance among kanji is often due to a shared graphic element. This shared element indicated the sound of the syllable represented by the character in late Old Chinese. The other element gave a vague, thesaurus-like hint of the kind of word in which the character was supposed to be used. Not all Chinese characters have this twofold graphic structure, but the overwhelming majority do. Because historical sound changes in languages are usually regular, those characters still provide mnemonic clues to the syllables they stand for in modern languages of the Sinitic family, such as Mandarin and Cantonese, and even in the Chinese-derived vocabulary of Japanese. If the majority of characters didn't provide such helpful mnemonics, one wonders how many ordinary speakers of those languages could learn how to read and write thousands of them with a fair degree of facility. Since this feature of the vast inventory of Chinese characters is so important, let me digress briefly to mention some important work done since 1998 on how the Chinese writing system took shape and the history of the Sinitic language family. The bold-facing here and in the following bibliographic slides emphasizes that these works came out after my talk. The Hungarian-American paleographer Imre Golombos demonstrated in 2010 that the process of standardizing the graphic forms of characters, contrary to traditional Chinese legends, occurred during the last 2 centuries of the first millennium BCE. William Baxter has updated the reconstruction of Old Chinese, which provided the phonological basis for the creation of the earliest phonetic semantic compound characters. Meantime, David Porter, building on the foundation laid earlier by John DeFrancis and D.E. Mongello, has explained in detail how Europeans came up with the fallacious idea that Chinese characters were ideograms. Remember those Catholic missionaries? An important implication of these advances in scholarship is that simply replacing the fantastic concept of ideogram with the more down-to-earth concept of logogram doesn't go far enough. Consider, for instance, the ill-considered claim once made by the late MIT linguist Morris Halle, who compared learning Chinese characters to memorizing pages of names and numbers in a telephone directory. Halle surely knew that Chinese characters are not ideograms, but he evidently believed that every writing system is necessarily grounded in one specific method of representation, either phonographic or logographic. Hence, the reason that there are tens of thousands more Chinese characters than letters in any alphabet must be that they are all logograms. How else could there be so many? This unjustified conclusion still has its advocates, but it's wrong all the same. It may be compared with Hegel's conclusion that there could be no planet-like body between Mars and Jupiter because of Bode's law, which was very soon disconfirmed by the discovery of the dwarf planet Ceres. Indeed, just as most Chinese characters are in fact partially phonographic, many words written alphabetically are partially logographic. Just consider how both English and French spellings egregiously violate the principle of one letter, one sound. Largely for practical reasons, orthographic changes always lag far behind sound changes. But even more interesting than the cause of spelling obsolescence is its effect. As spellings become anachronistic, the misleading letters used to spell thousands of words become much like the non-phonetic components embedded historically in most Chinese characters. With that in mind, it's hardly surprising that the processes of reading takes place in the brain in roughly the same way, regardless of the writing system tested. A far more realistic view of the typology of writing systems is that they all blend phonographic and logographic strategies of word representation. Although there are differences in how they do so, every naturally occurring writing system manages to balance things so that the system is learnable for almost everybody and easy to use in everyday situations. Indeed, we can compare any two writing systems in terms of how they achieve this practical balance. This is quite different from the black or white typology implicit in Halle's silly phone book analogy. The relative position of each writing system on this continuum informally expresses the relative degree to which each system relies on phonography and logography. Phonography to ensure ease of learning and use, and logography to ensure brevity of texts and long-term readability over time. Note carefully that this drawing is not to scale. No writing system is remotely close to the limits of pure phonography or pure logography. This can readily be inferred from examples of artificially created writing systems designed for special purposes that are genuine extreme cases. If you know the International Phonetic Alphabet and how linguists use it to notate practically any difference in pronunciation they can hear, then you have a good idea of extreme phonography. Computer-generated acoustic spectrograms of speech are arguably an even more extreme example of phonography, but let's stop with systems that can be written down on paper by hand. Here is a sample of only moderately detailed IPA transcriptions. It would obviously be burdensome to write English, French, or German this way in daily life. Not only would it be extremely hard for ordinary people to learn and use such a system accurately, but much of their effort would be wasted on capturing phonetic variation of little or no pragmatic value in ordinary written communication. This is the reason that elaborations of phonography usually stop when a writing system is close to having a one-to-one correspondence between letters and phonemes, as one finds, for example, in written Indonesian. Likewise, if you know something about cryptography, you know about code books, I'm not talking about cipher systems in which letters of a plain text message are scrambled, replaced according to some complicated rules, or both. I'm referring to books that resemble thick dictionaries, in which each word likely to be used in a message is assigned a unique substitute word or number, the sort of thing bound in lead that you're supposed to throw overboard if the enemy boards your ship. Here's part of a page of a secret code book from 1845 for use in the latest invention of the day, telegraphy. Once you understand the principle of cryptographic coding, the absurdity of Halley's idea of that memorizing Chinese characters is like memorizing a list of names and telephone numbers becomes obvious. Word substitution codes afford secrecy precisely because they mask the linguistic identity of words, just as phone numbers mask the identities of their owners. So too, if Chinese characters were nothing but pure logograms, then learning them would be like memorizing a phone book or a code book. Of course, hundreds of millions of people do learn and use Chinese writing for practical, everyday purposes. This is why I remarked earlier that this is not a scale drawing. All naturally occurring writing systems are crowded together in a rather compact interval on the continuum. Finnish and Spanish texts look very different from Chinese and Japanese texts, and the former are certainly more phonographic on average than the latter, but no writing system that is both learnable and usable for everyday purposes comes close to either the extremes exemplified by IPA transcriptions and codes. The foregoing arguments suffice to show that a radically dichotomous typology of the world's writing systems is simply wrong. But let me switch gears and offer another approach to the same conclusion by focusing on the meanings allegedly represented by ideograms and logograms. Are they independent of the meanings of spoken words or the gestures of a signed language? Are meanings eternal atom-like platonic objects that fill the universe, waiting for conscious, intelligent beings like us to associate them willy-nilly with spoken words, gestures, or visual signs on paper? Many cognitive scientists, alas, more or less think they are. They subscribe to a conception of semantics that to which we may apply the name computationalism, though it predates computers by many decades. Indeed, the Renaissance myth of Chinese ideograms may have been its origin. Perhaps the currently best known advocate of this view is Daniel Kahneman, who also thinks that evolution has burdened our brains, to continue the computer metaphor, with outmoded firmware. Others have taken the computer metaphor still further. Many linguists, anthropologists, and philosophers have, of course, long been skeptical of computationalism and its antecedents. I discuss several of them in my 2004 book, calling particular attention to the Soviet linguist Valentin Voloshinov and the late Oxford professor Roy Harris. Now I'll introduce research done since 1998, indicating that not only meanings, but also experiences of emotion and instances of reasoning are not hardwired routines, but rather highly context-sensitive processes that unfold in the brain every time its user encounters changes within the body or in the environment that call for a prompt response. Emotions, according to psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, are not universal, genetically encoded essences. She traces that idea from Descartes and Spinoza to the present, noting the important thinkers who endorsed it or objected to it along the way. She emphasizes that the behaviorists of the 1930s, despite diligent efforts to find consistent markers of hypothesized emotional essences, never found any. Remember that if you are ever facing a polygraph examination. But emotion essentialism has survived because of the influence of Floyd Allport in the 1920s and Noam Chomsky, starting with his famous criticism of B.F. Skinner's theories of language. On Barrett's account, which is based, like that of Daan, on the results of fMRI studies, the brain is a prediction-making organ, constantly updating its bank of experiences and memories as it receives, filters, and acts on external and internal sense data. We speak as if emotions were pre-programmed biochemical routines triggered when the brain is stimulated in a particular way, but as Barrett notes, what we call feelings are only one aspect of how the individual negotiates an ever-changing environment. For this reason, what we call a single emotion in hindsight can manifest itself in many ways. As Barrett observes, and I quote, "You can tremble in fear, jump in fear, freeze in fear, scream in fear, gasp in fear, hide in fear, attack in fear, and even laugh in the face of fear. Each occurrence of fear is associated with a different set of internal changes and sensations." In short, though we may categorize a particular experience as fear, in retrospect, that is no reason to believe in a platonic or physiological essence worthy of the label fear. Another important study of 2017 makes a similar claim, but this time about what we informally call reasoning. Just as emotion experiences, according to Barrett, emerge through mental simulations of what the brain anticipates will happen at the next moment, so do instances of reasoning, according to Mercier and Sperber. To quote them directly, animals make inferences all the time. They use what they already know to draw conclusions about what they don't know. For instance, to anticipate what may happen next and to act accordingly. In other words, the brain does its best to keep its owner out of trouble by solving immediate problems. Human reasoning has evolved in the way it has, largely because so many of those problems fall into four broad, evolutionarily significant categories, well known to anthropologists. These are, as Barrett reminds us, the four F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. Mercier and Sperber skip the joke, but offer a detailed set of definitions for different kinds of mental activity we informally call reasoning, placing them in a nested set structure. They emphasize that human beings are exceptional only in that, to quote them directly once more, many of these mechanisms are not instincts, but are acquired through interaction with other people during the child's development. They call conscious inferences of this kind intuitions. They do not think reason is something opposed to intuition, as does Kahneman, but argue instead that reason itself is a kind of intuitive inference. Mercier and Sperber thus reject a computational view of reasoning, just as Barrett rejects the essentialist view of emotions. Two more studies offer experimental evidence that likewise linguistic meanings are neither essences nor just stored data. They begin to elucidate how the brain performs the process of meaning construction in real time by focusing on a phenomenon called N400. N400 refers to a large change of electrical potential broadly distributed over the scalp that peaks around 400 milliseconds and is consistently elicited when a subject is presented with semantically unexpected words or unusual syntactic patterns. It was first detected in 1980 by Marta Kutas and Kara Federmeyer. 30 years later, in a review of more than 1,000 studies since that time, Kutas and Federmeyer described the state of knowledge as follows. N400 arises from a time period in which stimulus-driven activity enters into temporal synchrony with a broad multimodal neural network whose current states have been shaped by recent and long-term experience of a wide range of types. Notably, on this view, conceptual representations are not looked up in memory, but are dynamically created and highly context dependent. Because semantic memory states are continuously changing, the meaning of a given stimulus, defined as the configuration of neural activity that is bound together in response to that stimulus, will be somewhat different across people, time, contexts, and processing circumstances. This highlights the fact that the meaning of a stimulus is not computed at a single point in time, but rather is something that emerges through time, with the activity measured in the N400 representing an important aspect of that emergent process, but not certainly the final state. I quote this passage at length because of its many clear similarities with the statements of Barrett, Mercier, and Swerber. At the end of February 2018, new empirical evidence for the N400 account of meaning construction was presented by Michael Broderick and three colleagues. Using a model of words as vectors of 400 components, they devised a temporal response function that measures the semantic dissimilarity of the last word added to a string that is part of an emerging spoken sentence relative to the preceding words in the string. The Broderick team demonstrated through controlled experiments that the change in this statistic closely correlates with N400, thereby sharpening the conclusions of Kutas and Federmeyer. The methodology of Broderick et al. Can be criticized from a linguistic standpoint for not precisely specifying what counts as a spoken word and for using a rather crude statistic to summarize the effects of context on lexical interpretation. Nevertheless, their results were obtained using a large amount of natural spoken stimulus. Written material in which visual backtracking could not be prevented was not used. As improvements in experimental technique are made, we should expect to gain greater understanding of the dynamic nature of meaning creation during the N400 interval and longer stretches of language use. As I said earlier, the computational accounts of semantics have deep roots. Around the beginning of the 20th century, it pops up, for example, in this diagram created by the influential Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. He wished to illustrate how language works in interpersonal communication. If you accept this picture as accurate, then the success of a linguistic act is to be measured by how precisely the transmitted and received concepts in the brains of the communicators match. I call this the fax machine model of language. The new research just presented suggests, on the contrary, that meanings, like emotions and reasoning, are private experiences of an individual acting in the context of specific circumstances. Indeed, communication can be pragmatically successful even when the meaning creation experiences of two individuals are quite a bit less than identical. To use an analogy suggested by Roy Harris, linguistic communication is not like buying things for money in a shop where every item has a fixed price and the seller expects the equivalent in cash. Linguistic communication is rather like bartering, in which each participant believes the item received is worth more than the item relinquished. The process works not because of agreement on some sort of semantic price, but because of a disagreement on the relative value of the items exchanged. The transaction is successful precisely because each participant gets to assign a different meaning to it. Of course, it is convenient to speak retrospectively of meanings as if they were public Platonic essences like prices. But in reality, the brain constructs meanings every time it engages in linguistic behavior. the constraints imposed by context play as important a role as the grammatical and phonological rules of language in preventing idiosyncratic differences in meanings from causing effective communication to break down, at least most of the time. Let's tie this back to the old claims made about Chinese characters and the dichotomous typology of writing systems. Consider this syllogism. Its major premise, marked in blue, concerns meaning as it arises in acts of language use, typically speech. Its minor premise, marked in green, consists of two well-known facts. First, to the extent that two written symbols are visually distinct, they are different symbols. Second, chunks of speech contrast with one another in two ways, in terms of phonemes, which are in themselves meaningless units, and in terms of higher level structures, such as words, phrases, sentences, and entire discourses, for which we construct meanings. From the conjunction of these two premises, it follows that written symbols are never linked to meaning independently of the context in which they occur. Roy Harris once illustrated this vividly with what might be called an existentialist image, a photograph of a discarded road sign in a junk heap, rusty but still legible, pointing absurdly to a town that wasn't there. The message had not changed, but the context had, and so too whatever meaning someone might give the sign. Before concluding, I need to emphasize that the foregoing review of new studies arguing against computationalism is hardly exhaustive. Here are 4 more studies, each addressing some flawed aspect of the mind as computer metaphor. Their topics are highly diverse. Camaro gives a heavy-duty philosophical critique of cognitive science of the kind championed by the well-known computationalist Jerry Fodor. Sloman and Fernbach emphasize that much of what we think we know is the result of social interactions. Corballis attacks Chomsky for evading questions about the evolution of language. Pitt's book discusses the history of science and takes issue with Thomas Kuhn's well-known model of scientific progress. It may seem a bit out of place in this list, but I include it because, partly, its title suggests a good name for the new understanding of feeling, reasoning, meaning, and thinking I've just summarized. They are all Heraclitean in that they stress the importance of the role of the ever-changing context in which we act. They warn us that despite how we talk about them, feelings, reasons, meanings, and thoughts are not retrievable things, but rather experiences, like stepping in a stream. As Heraclitus observed, it's never exactly the same stream twice. Pitt is primarily concerned with demonstrating that changes in technological infrastructures alter what counts as scientific evidence. New instruments show us things we previously did not know were there. This might seem like just a special case of the McLuhanite adage, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. But instead of indulging in Joycean puns and unconventional interpretations of history, Pitt ties his arguments to the historiography of science. At any rate, I hope you now agree, unlike some in my 1998 audience, that debunking old but fallacious ideas about Chinese characters goes far beyond de-exoticizing East Asian cultures or scrimmaging with postmodernists. The persistence of misconceptions about Chinese writing and writing system typology in general should serve as a warning to scholars in a wide range of disciplines. As Goethe put it nearly 2 centuries ago, we should expect that some first guesses will turn out to be wrong. What we must avoid is hanging on to them stubbornly in the face of disconfirming empirical evidence. Thank you. Jason, are you there?
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. This is a
Okay.
very interesting talk that has lots of ramifications that I can't even quite imagine what they all are, different to different people, different area of research. Now I'd like to invite any questions that anyone has, and you can either write them out in the shared screen, or you can just say something and make yourself wave your hand or something and allow yourself to be seen, and then ask the question yourself. So any questions?
There's one hand is waving.
Okay, I don't see it, but go ahead.
It's Dr. Fisher. Jason, do I control the flow here or what? I click on
Yeah, if Dr. Fisher wants to start speaking, they're welcome to unmute themselves and
okay,
question.
right. You have to unmute yourself. Well,
Okay, any other questions? It's a quiet crowd on a gloomy afternoon.
a lot of people have their video off, so it's impossible to see who's actually here.
Okay.
Hang on, let's see.
John Rush now has made a statement wondering if this will be available online, again, for those who wish to hear it again. So I missed a few bibliographic
Right.
references.
There's John. John, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Jim, how are you?
Okay, you had a question? Oops.
The first couple of minutes, I was wondering, and I think you don't know, whether we could view this again later sometime.
Oh, yes, it's being recorded. So if you contact the Emeritus Academy, they can get you a recording.
Thank you, Jim. And I didn't quite I wasn't writing down fast enough to get all the bibliographic references. Are those available somewhere?
I mean, I could send you the PPT file.
Thank you.
Right.
So
By the way, Jim, I of course enjoyed that very much, and there's a lot to think about.
Oh, good.
So Jim, I have a question for you. We all know this is a big leap. You know, we all know that our dogs understand us and we can understand them. So how does speech have people worried about the kind of thing you're talking about, but jumping to other species and how they perceive and et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, cross-species communication, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
No, well, that's not really, I mean, my point in the talk is just to, as I said back in 1998, the idea that Chinese writing is ideographic, and even the idea that it's nothing but logographic is just wrong. And the point is that all this new research that has taken place in the intervening time not only shows that, but contextualizes that claim by showing that not only linguistic meaning, but even things like emotions and instances of reasoning are similarly context-dependent processes that emerge in the brain in real time. They're not, the opposite view, the computational view is that somehow all this stuff is somehow stored and retrieved as if your brain were nothing but a computer. And there's now more and more empirical evidence suggesting that that's just the wrong way to look at it. Now, what does that say about interspecies communication? Obviously, it puts that question in a completely different light from what it would be if you assumed that there has to be something in the human mind that distinguishes it from all others, right? That's basically the kind of claim that Chomsky was making earlier and was taken up by linguists like Derek Bickerton, that somehow in the process of evolution, some miraculous event took place and human beings became endowed with a language creation organ somewhere in their brains, and that no other animals could possibly be like that. And all right, so at that level, the answer to your question is that's probably not right. But I don't know if I can answer it in any greater detail than that at this time.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective, for sure. Any other questions for Jim?
Yeah, Jim, may I ask you maybe an unrelated question? I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
I just happen to have looked at some articles somewhere about Chinese characters reflecting Noah, the flood story from the Bible. And I sent you a link in chat that you can just click on, maybe very
I'll
fast,
take a look.
and see the characters. If you recognize these characters, I do not, certainly. It's just interesting for me if it has any meaning. Presumably you haven't looked at it, but
I'll have to look at this later after the lecture, but the short answer is anybody who thinks that it has something to do with the biblical story of the flood is probably mistaken. There's still a big debate as to what the hell the biblical story of the flood refers to. Certainly, it comes out of sources earlier than the Hebrew Bible. I mean, it was part of a Babylonian myth cycle that antedated that. And there have even been suggestions that flood myths in different parts of the world are not due to any kind of memory of an actual event, but are actually references to the gradual precession of the North Star in the sky. But that's a whole, I can give you a source on that if you're interested. There is a very interesting book by a husband and wife pair of anthropologists named Barber, published by Princeton University Press back in 2004, I think it was, called When They Severed Earth from Sky, which is a very interesting study of mythology in general. So that would be a good starting point to evaluate that question or that claim. Yeah.
in any case, this article points out characters to do with boats and Chinese names similar to Noah, and some similarities that are surprising because of the big distance between the two cultures, say the Babylonian and the Chinese. So it's interesting for what you think, but the stories have some similarity.
I don't know what field you're in, but years ago, there was a very distinguished scholar of ancient West Asia, Cyrus Gordon, who I once heard give a lecture trying to claim that the 10 heavenly stems and 12 branches of used in the Chinese sexagenary counting cycle actually gave rise to the Phoenician alphabet. So lots of people have lots of strange ideas, and you have to really look at things in terms of archaeology and what we really know on a factual basis. All kinds of wild claims can easily be made. You have to take everything with a grain of salt.
Another comment on that, and to bring you down to earth, there's a book called The Rocks Don't Lie. I'm a geologist.
Pardon?
And I'm a geologist, and the book is called The Rocks Don't Lie.
Oh, yes, yes, I've read that, yes.
And they make the claim that there's, in the collective memory of almost every ancient civilization, there was a major catastrophic flood. And they have stories about them.
Well, as I said, that's one interpretation. Barber and Barber point out that you get flood stories even in places that didn't have floods, like up in the Andes. And that's one of the reasons they feel that the flood story, the myth that about the flood doesn't necessarily refer to a physical flood. There was a theory for a long time that the Black Sea was filled in from the Mediterranean, and that's what the flood story in the Akkadian literature refers to. I mean, who can say, right?
It's fun to think about, absolutely.
Right.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, we're getting off the topic, yeah.
Other questions for Jim?
Maybe one more question. Do you have kind of a not very long summary of your lecture?
Well, you can read my 2004 book. I have a whole book on this called Ideogram, the myth of the Chinese characters and the myth of disembodied meaning, which you can get your hands on easily. I'm sure it's in the library. So that, that's a good starting point. And then I have
is there a survey?
Since then, I've been doing work in a number of other areas too. So I haven't just been working on this exclusively. As was mentioned at the beginning, actually after retirement, I've been working on pre-modern Japanese mathematics. So transcribing old manuscripts and trying to make, making sense of them and so forth. Anyone else out there? I'm looking at this list of faces I see. Most people have turned off their video. Who else is here?
Okay, well, one last ask. Are any further questions for Jim? And if not, I want to thank you all for coming and listening to Jim's talk. I think it was very interesting indeed. Mm-hmm. And have a wonderful break. And our next meeting will be on February 2nd, and we'll see you then.